Good morning, everyone, and welcome to FPSA Webinar Wednesday. I'm Jen Jedwalenik, Director of Engagement and Education at FPSA. Today, I'll be moderating the conversation, The Accountability Advantage, Coaching Skills Every Manufacturing Leader Needs. I have the great pleasure of working closely with our members, our councils, and our networks, and a big part of my role is listening to what they're experiencing in their businesses and then customizing our education around the challenges and opportunities that matter most to them. I also spend a surprising amount of my time trying to get really busy people moving in the same direction. Apparently, there's a name for that, and it's accountability. So I'm particularly excited to moderate today's conversation and learn alongside all of you. We don't want this to be a webinar where you sit and listen. We want our audience participating as well. So please make sure that you participate in the chat when we ask questions and help us work through some of the real world scenarios. We are grateful to have our two panelists with us today, Dave Gregory, Director of Learning and Development with Weber, and Darin Zehr, General Manager, Commercial Food Sanitation. Before we jump in, I would like for each of you to tell everyone a little bit about yourselves, and specifically the experience you bring to this conversation. Dave, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I'm Dave Gregory, Director of Learning and Development for Weber Inc. I've got more than 30 years of workforce development and organizational performance experience. In my role, I help manufacturing organizations build capability, strengthen accountability, and improve business results. And at Weber Academy, my focus is ensuring that learning translates into ownership, execution, and measurable performance improvement. And I'm excited to be part of the discussion today. Thanks.
Thank you. Darin?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Jennifer. So I've had Darin Zehr. I'm the General Manager for Commercial Food Sanitation, or CFS, as Jennifer mentioned. I have 36 years in food, 30 of those years formerly leading people. I was with Kraft Foods for 22 years and worked in roles supervisor on up through business unit manager and plant manager. And the last 14 years, I've been with CFS in different roles and now as the general manager. And at CFS, we do coaching, consulting, training in the areas of food safety, specifically around sanitation, hygienic design, and overall product protection. All of that means I've had a lot of opportunities to not handle situations correctly regarding accountability and coaching. But fortunately, I've also been given lots of grace. I've had good people I've worked with, good mentors around me, and I've also been able to learn and grow over my career through that. And I also don't want to discount the fact that I've learned a lot over the years, being a husband, a father of two son-in-laws and a daughter-in-law, and now a grandfather. And then also, being involved in community groups, on boards, and industry groups, including IFP here, where all of those kind of inform some of my decisions that I make over the years.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you both. We have the coaching expert, Dave, and the practitioner, Darin, at the table. So let's put both perspectives to work. So we're going to start here. Dave, we are having a little bit of complication with our chat, so I'm trying to make sure that we turn it on. And I was going to ask the audience something here, but I wanted to ask you, let's get started with this. Before, when you think about having an accountability conversation, what do you think is the hardest part? Starting it, being direct, dealing with defensiveness, getting actual follow-through? That was the question we were going to ask our chat. So I'm sure you can conceive what are the issues that people would have, if you could bounce off of that, and then tell us how we can fairly hold someone accountable before, just to be clear. What has to be clear before we have a conversation?
Yeah, clear is a good word for it, right? It starts with clear expectations and making sure that people truly understand what's expected of them in the workplace. And so when I think about having those accountability conversations, if clarity hasn't been created with the expectations of performance, then it can be very challenging to have the accountability conversation because it's not really fair to hold somebody accountable to something they didn't know they were accountable for. I like to have accountability conversations by making sure that I'm talking about a particular end result that we're seeking to achieve, what I like to call a metric or performance, key performance indicator, right? Some type of KPI that we've agreed to. And then to peel that back to really look at what are the behaviors that drive that particular performance indicator and which changes does that person need to make as it relates to different behaviors that might influence that KPI. And then when we understand that behavior, then we can start to understand, does the person have the requisite knowledge they need of that behavior? Do they know what the skill is in demonstrating that? Have they had an opportunity to do it in a live environment versus maybe just a classroom or practice someplace? And then what's their willingness to demonstrate that behavior consistently? And so I think when we can create that level of clarity around what are we measuring, and they know those expectations, and then we can be clear on what are the behaviors that drive that, accountability conversations become easier because I'm not talking about the character of the person. I'm simply talking about a behavior that drives a result that we've agreed we need to achieve.
Awesome. So really is clarity and making sure that the person that you're having this conversation with really understands what it is they're supposed to be doing. Darin, when you think about accountability from the leader's seat, what are people actually accountable for? And where have you seen them break down in the real world?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And I'm glad Dave talked about behaviors and stuff because I think when we do step back and look, what are we accountable for and what do we expect? Yeah, we're definitely accountable for our results, but we also expect people to be accountable for how they collaborate. Are they seeking truth and making decisions? An email response, their words, their people we're all accountable for all of that, being honest, kind of some baseline items, not playing the victim. So we're accountable for how we react to things, being prepared for a meeting, being prepared for a conversation. Are we seeking to understand? All of those attributes we're accountable for, and ultimately, we really want to build trust, and that helps in discussions in the future. And I think Dave used clarity and I would say transportation or transparency with that clarity out kind of all flows in together, and that helps with discussions. I think where it breaks down, I think there's many reasons. I think when silos are allowed to form, when there's bad communication, kind of the lack of transparency or clarity we talked about. I think in my past, I have failed to hold people accountable when I don't have the complete picture or I'm assuming something. Um, we had a situation where we hired a maintenance manager at one point, and I was a plant manager. He reported into the business unit manager. And during the interview process, there was something that didn't seem quite right to me, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. The business unit manager really felt good with this person. The interview team did, and so we ended up hiring this person. And I think early on we give some rope to allow this person to succeed. But what I was hearing out on the floor was a little mixed, and some of the operators were having some challenges, and some of the maintenance people, on the other hand, were very positive on this person. And I think initially I interpreted, and I would say we collectively interpreted it, the leadership team, as more of a production maintenance conflict and all of that. And maybe we lost 6 months in that churn and probably didn't do a good job of listening to some of the veterans because it wasn't a conflict in production versus maintenance. It turned out it was a conflict versus what is the mission? What are we trying to accomplish? The commitment of that person and this maintenance manager did not stack up. And I would even say competency. So there ended up being separation. But I think early on, again, we kind of I misplaced and misread the situation, and it turned out there was a disconnect that was not going to get um, put together. And I think from an accountability standpoint, I did a poor job of holding that person accountable ultimately, and we lost some time and lost some performance out of that.
It's awesome to have real world examples, and especially sometimes when we realize that we didn't do something as effectively, then that's the opportunity to really learn. So I certainly appreciate that. Um, so basically, what we're moving forward with is clarity and transparency. Those are the two things that are the most important. Um, the obvious question to me then, if accountability is so important, why do so many of us delay the conversation even when we know it needs to happen? Dave, what makes otherwise strong leaders, strong employees avoid or soften accountability conversations?
Well, they're difficult. And a lot of times we don't like to do difficult things, right? I mean, as Darin was saying, how many times have we failed at accountability conversations, right? And sometimes it's because we miss just one small thing that we thought that that person knew they were expected to do. And we begin the conversation and suddenly find out that no, they didn't think that was part of their responsibility. And yet we're trying to hold them accountable for it. And then we've got to be able to backtrack and, look at it and go, okay, where did I miss this as their leader, or where did we as an organization miss the communication? Because so much of what happens when we get pushback from people is either they truly didn't understand what their role was, and how they were going to be accountable to that role, or oftentimes they feel like we're attacking them individually. And that's why when we talk about behaviors being the conversation that has to be part of that accountability discussion, it's because I'm truly not trying to assess the person, right? Unless it's an ethical issue that we're dealing with, right? Honesty, integrity, those types of things. Maybe that's a character flaw that they have. And then I'm not necessarily having a coaching conversation. That might be a discipline conversation, right? And so when we think about accountability, I think we need to separate coaching accountability, where I'm trying to improve performance, versus a discipline conversation, which I'm trying to stop them from doing something. And if they continue doing that thing, they're no longer going to work here, right? And so make sure you're separating the differences in your conversations between those two things. When it's coaching and it truly is about improving their level of performance, then it's, as Darin mentioned, people have to know that we know what's going on. And if you don't know what's going on, you won't be able to identify the behavior that needs to change. And so it's not that you're micromanaging someone, you just have to be aware of how are they behaving when they're executing on the tasks that they have in front of them. And which behaviors are they really good at, and which ones are they not so good at, and which ones do they not do at all? And that should dictate then how you coach people.
Dave, in our prep, you mentioned a very simple technique, asking for permission to give feedback. Can you walk
Yes.
me through what that looks like?
Yeah, I think it's really important that people have an opportunity to be prepared for an accountability conversation, right? It's a safety issue, right? In a plant, if there's a safety issue, I'm going to not ask for permission to give feedback. I'm just going to stop them from cutting off their hand, right? So that's different. But what I'm talking about is if I have performance feedback I need to give, I want to make sure that person's in the right frame of mind for us to have that discussion. And so I think it's important for leaders to care enough about their people to be willing to ask, hey, I've got some feedback I'd like to provide to you about this particular performance piece. Is now a good time for us to discuss that? Or would you like to discuss it at a different time? Right now, if they say 3 weeks from Monday, right, then that's too far away, right? And I might suggest that we do it tomorrow. But getting permission to provide feedback allows that person to get in the frame of mind to understand I'm going to get feedback about how I'm performing. And people have to know that the reason we're providing that to them is because we care about them, right? If we're giving people feedback about performance and it's interpreted as being negative and that I'm, holding you accountable because I don't like you, then they're never going to be willing to change their behavior because of that, right? And that's where people seek other leaders, and they often leave those organizations where feedback isn't given properly. When people know that we care, I care about your performance because I care about you. I'm providing you feedback with the right intent. And when people know that, you're willing to ask permission to give them feedback, the feedback sessions become so much easier and so much more productive because they'll actually be willing to change that behavior.
Absolutely. Darin, I know you've mentored many leaders unofficially and officially. Do you have an experience that you can draw from to bounce off to build on what Dave just said?
Yeah, I think so I will talk about that in just a moment. One of the things on the tough conversations, I'm glad Dave said it, it deserves the name tough conversations. And by
Mm,
default, sometimes we push it off. And you think about a leader um, in an organization at most levels in manufacturing and operations, the laundry list of stuff they can be working on is quite large.
mm.
So it is easy to push off tougher things because there's other things that are also important. And so how to prioritize that becomes a real, thoughtful process. And I liked his comment about, caring for the people and stuff. I had a situation, I feel like I got to do a disclaimer before sharing this.
Mm.
Um, make sure before you do something like this, you're having really good conversations with your HR group, and how to approach and even different aspects. So I was a plant manager, a relatively small plant. We had 70, 80 people, and we had an operator very good at what she did, very capable. But there was a bit of buzz and that she had a drinking problem and that it wasn't just retained for after work. It was something that she was actually coming in under the influence, and she worked on a second shift. And typically, the way to approach that would have been to, catch her at some point where you could smell the alcohol, and then send her off to get tested, or an accident happens and she gets tested. But of course, they're both reactive, and they're still both tough. They're still both tough situations to deal with. And this one kind of went on a little bit, and I was a newer plant manager, and I just didn't feel right waiting for the gotcha moment, especially knowing that it could be a safety issue. And so we talked it through with HR and ended up pulling her in to a discussion, and had another person with me, obviously, our HR rep, but really went through a discussion of, we're hearing this, and she, if you've been in a manufacturing environment long, if there's a buzz, there's probably something behind it. People see people out in the town and in the bars or whatever. And a little bit of a backstory also on this lady. She had I think a 6-year-old son at the time, and her husband worked at the plant too. So I will say I'm not sure I've had more awkward 20-minute discussion than that one. When we pulled her in, there was just a lot of you know silence and just kind of frank discussion on what we're hearing, and there was a lot of denial. But about 20 minutes in, she opened up. She started crying, sharing that she had the issue, and it kind of broke open the whole discussion, because now it became more of a solution. Okay, how can we help? how do we work through this, and support her. Now, clearly, the onus is on her, but also, we had resources that we could help. And then, maybe to continue the story a little bit to its conclusion, she actually called a center to get admitted. She was that convicted following this discussion, and the center declined. And they basically said, you either need a doctor's note or, something that gets you admitted. So she came in to me very frustrated. She's saying, I'm trying to get help. I'm being told no. And so I called the center. And again, not saying, work with your company. This might be the young plant manager in me at the time, feeling I could change the world. But I called the center, talked to the doctor and said, really, you're going to wait until something happens and then it's okay. Well, anyway, through discussion, she got in, she got support, and was able to afford it with how it was treated. And she got out and was much better. Now, so I'll wait to the final end of the story, but the bottom line, why I'm bringing this into accountability is, a fair amount of the plant knew there was a buzz. And, I felt accountable to the team. Like, one, we're not going to have an accident because of this when it's pretty much common knowledge. I felt accountable to her. Again, fairly common knowledge. She owns it, but at the end of the day, if there's anything we can do to help it or I could do to help it, I wanted to engage in that. And then Dave talked about the caring. So if I really cared about our people, I would address this. And so at the end of it all, I was going through the plant when this was I was being transferred to another plant as plant manager, and her husband, when I went to say goodbye to him, he said, Darin, I think you saved her life. So it turned out it was so bad at home because of her drinking, but that was all kind of being hidden. But he knew she was in a really rough spot, and this helped break her free from it. So, I think I was fortunate to be part of it. The HR person that worked with me, and fortunate it worked out in such a way. But I think that's a tough situation that you look at it and you say, do I deal with it now, or do I wait for more tough situations because of this, of what's going on? And, chose the upfront, let's do it. And I think that can help inform how to prioritize. If I don't do anything, am I actually just delaying worse? Or am I, or where does that stand? And I think that can help in prioritization of when do you address something.
Darin, I really appreciate that story. And one of the things that I think you identified by addressing it was that other people in the plant knew, right? They're watching leadership all the time. How are we going to address poor behavior, right? In this particular case, it could have been catastrophic if she would have had an accident, right? Oftentimes, when we're talking about performance behavior, maybe we're not going to get the yield that we need or the throughput that we need in a plant if somebody doesn't improve the behavior and how they're operating a machine or how they're maintaining machine availability, doing PMs, that sort of thing. So it might not be life-threatening, right? But it's still important to the people who are doing the right things to know that we are willing to hold people accountable to the standards that we're setting. Because as soon as we let performance go from one person, then they start questioning why am I being held accountable if we hold them accountable for something else, right? And I see it all the time where attendance issues, for example, if I'm willing to have an attendance conversation with someone and hold them accountable to our attendance standards, then it's very challenging for other people to be held accountable to that same standard. And yet some supervisors may have a strict policy on it, and a different supervisor in the same plant, maybe on a different shift, doesn't have that. And then that causes friction within the plant because we all want to be held to the same standard, right? Just from a fairness doctrine perspective. And so I think what you identified early was you hold people accountable because it's the right thing to do, not just for them, but for everybody else in the plant, because you cared about all of those people. And having the difficult conversation you have to do. Otherwise, give up your title as a leader because you're not really leading then.
That's right, Dave.
Absolutely. Those are very powerful observation, Darin. For easy when we're thinking of the big situations to be able to remember it. So thank you for that. And then Dave, thank you for bringing it back to a more common day attendance issue. Okay, so I'd like to bring our audience in. I think we've gotten chat fixed. Our first question for everyone is, which is harder for you personally, giving difficult feedback or receiving it? Just type giving or receiving. Hopefully we'll get some responses. So far we have giving. Dave, if you had to make a guess, what do you think would be the more difficult side, giving or receiving it?
Well, I think giving feedback is challenging if the only feedback you're giving is corrective action feedback. I think one of the most fun things about providing feedback to people is giving feedback when things are going well and being specific enough about the behaviors that they're demonstrating that they understand that you're watching when things go well and you're praising them. One of the things that I've known for many years, because I learned this through a great leader of mine, was that he told me that we have to give about 7 times as much positive feedback as we give corrective feedback. If we want people to truly understand that we care about them, caring about them means I'm recognizing when you're doing things right, right? It's even when you show up on time, right? Thanks for coming in today, right? It's easy thing like that starts to build that trust and that level of, hey, I'm noticing what you're doing and I'm giving you feedback. Hey, when you operated that machinery today, you ran the plant today, we attained our goal, right? Fantastic. Make sure you're giving that so that when it's time to give
Mhm.
corrective action, right, and you've gained the permission to give that, then people are much more willing to listen because they trust you and they know that you do care about them. If giving feedback is only about providing negative feedback, it's not only really hard, but people don't want to have the conversation with you because they're as soon as you come to them, you show up, they expect it to be
Mhm.
negative, right? One of the tests I like to do with people is to say, hey, you just got an email from your boss that says, hey, can you come see me in my office? What's your initial thought? If your initial thought is, oh no, then that leader's probably failed you in some ways. If your initial thought is great, then you know that you're giving enough feedback to that person that's also positive, that you're not just asking them to come visit with you when it's something that's negative. And so to me, that's why giving is oftentimes so hard. Receiving feedback, when it's good feedback, it's easy to receive, right? All those great chemicals in our brain go off and we're happy. When we receive negative feedback, if I know the person cares about me and it's specific enough to a specific behavior that I know I need to change, then I can hear what they're asking me to change. And if they're giving me a methodology to help me change it, which is what great feedback sounds like, right? Let's work on this. Or how do you think you can work on this particular behavior, depending on what their knowledge and skill level is? Then people are willing to make the change. And so to me, it's all about feedback has to be both positive and it has to be corrective at times. And some people view that as negative. I don't view corrective feedback when done properly as negative. I know you're giving it to me for the right reasons. And I know it's something if I change and improve, then I'm going to get positive feedback.
I know most of our participants are thinking, what does my team think when I ask them to come down to my office? So it's definitely that's an interesting litmus test that I'm sure everyone will be thinking about. Okay, so we know that giving this feedback is difficult, but could you break down for us, Dave, what the anatomy of an accountability conversation looks like?
Yeah, it has to start with that key performance indicator. What are we going to be talking about, right? In a plant, it could be lots of different things. I like to talk about machine availability time if you're working with a maintenance team, right? Maybe it's throughput if you're talking about an operations team or yield or giveaway, right? Whatever your KPIs are, it starts with the KPI. And if we're doing great and we're giving positive feedback, easy to do. If I have to correct the way people are behaving so that we can improve the result that we're seeking, then I have to have enough understanding of what they're doing to be able to identify which behavior am I going to give feedback about. And make sure that you don't give feedback on 5 or 6 different behaviors all at once, right? You have to limit that to, I like to say 1 to 2. And when you're providing feedback on 1 to 2 things, people can actually work on that. Then, as the provider of the feedback, I have to assess what's their knowledge level of that particular behavior. And so there's 2 questions I ask when it comes to knowledge. The first question is, can they define the behavior? Do they know what that behavior is? And then the second question is, do they know why it's important?
Hmm.
Because if they don't know why it's important, they're much less likely to demonstrate it. And then the next question is, can they do it when it matters? Right? Can they do it actually in the moment when performance is needed? And then the last piece is, are they willing to do it or not? And willingness, some people look at willingness and say, if they're not willing, then that's a bad thing. The reason they might not be willing is because they don't have the knowledge they need and they don't have the skill they need. Well, none of us like to do things that we're not good at or we don't know how to do. And so that's just natural. I would prefer that versus someone who doesn't have the requisite knowledge or skill and is very enthusiastic about trying to do it. I like to use the example of riding a motorbike. If you've never ridden a dirt bike before and you see someone riding a dirt bike and you say, "Hey, I want to try that. I think I can do that." You're probably going to crash and burn, right? Whereas if you have somebody who says, "I'd like to learn that. I'd like to know how to do that better," then we can teach them and we can do it in a safe way, right? No different than operating equipment in a plant. If you've never operated equipment and you say, "Boy, I think I can jump up there on that screen and I can change these parameters so that we can operate better," it's probably going to be disastrous. Whereas if you ask the question of, "Hey, I want to help, I want to learn how to do this," that's willingness to learn. Those people we can teach, right? And so I think you have to look at it from that breakdown of what is it that we're trying to improve? What's the behavior that needs to change in a positive way, right? Because if we get negative behavior change, results go down. If you keep doing the same thing over and over, you keep getting the same thing. So it's positive behavior change is needed to improve results. And then what's the knowledge level? What's the skill level? And what's the willingness level?
So you're being very careful to make sure that you're coaching the behavior and not judging the person.
Absolutely. As
Okay.
soon as they feel judged, then it becomes a negative experience. Nobody likes to be judged.
Darin, can you bring us back to the plant floor and tell us what does this look like when you're actually doing it, when you're actually in the moment?
Yeah, I think of I can't honestly think of a very specific scenario to share, but I can think of kind of what I've seen as trends and maybe breakthrough conversations in this space where and we're not talking about people in this case. I will say the people I'm thinking of are more in the you expect them to be delivering well because they have the attributes, they fit the culture, they're driven, but then you see results that they're accountable for that aren't where they need to be. And I think that initial discussion of seeking to understand, what's the gap? Because I think and Dave mentioned, about line up time and in that space, if I think about like turnaround time, whether it's from a sanitation process or it's a changeover and discussions in that space, sometimes let's say the expectation is an hour for whatever to go on. And you realize through discussion, through discovery, into discussion around, the lack of delivering a result, that the very best case delivers an hour. And we expect everything to be spot on. And maybe we're expecting improvement. So now we've just taken the very best case of an hour and said, well, let's make it 50 minutes just because that's how improvement looks. But through discovery, collaboration, seeking to understand, you find out, okay, there's these choke points that make the best case to be an hour, but the realistic case probably to be not plus or minus 10, but minus 10 many times. And so then how do you use your position, the resources you have access to that maybe they don't initially, to change that landscape? So now the best case becomes like 45 minutes because you've brought resources to play. You've changed something in the scenario. And so now expecting the hour to or 50 minutes is much more reasonable. So now you're actually supporting that person, helping them deliver on that. And then the coaching moment, I think within that is like, don't sit on that stuff, bring it forward, engage earlier. So it changes that moment, but it also changes the future. You've created someone who feels more empowered to engage in those improvement processes, and they're more holistic in their thought about how am I going to deliver this, which makes them accountable, but it makes them realize like I'm going to do whatever I can to do this. And the what's possible, it broadens greatly, because otherwise they've lived kind of in this box of what's in my immediate control, and they start thinking about what could be possible out there. And so then become a collaborator on full process improvement and much broader thinker, and a much potentially better leader in the future.
Darin, I love the thought process there of continuous improvement, right? It's one of the things we're always looking at when we think about performance, overall organizational performance. It has to start with understanding what are the processes, the best practice processes that we could do as a individual and as a group. And then do the people have the requisite knowledge and skill and willingness to consistently demonstrate those processes? When they do, so you've got your processes optimized, you've got your people optimized, that's where you get the best performance. And oftentimes, when I think of sanitation as an example, and you might have one group doing disassembly, you might have another group doing reassembly, right? It's about practice allows us to get better and faster at disassembling the machinery that we need. And do we have a process on where each one of those pieces is going to go? Right? We have carts that come with Weber equipment. And oftentimes I hear people don't know how to use the carts. Well, that's a bad training job on our part if we haven't trained them how to use the cart properly, right? When they understand those things, then they can follow that process of disassembly so that reassembly is easier. I also love when they're asked, how fast do you think you can accurately and safely disassemble this machine? Because we might set a standard of 30 minutes and they might say, well, we can do it in 20. Well, if you can do it safely because of the practice you've had and you can do that in 20, okay. But does 20 is the best, right? Not everybody can do it in that. What's a reasonable time for this to be able to be done? And as you look at each one of your processes and you come up with those mean times for those different activities, you get a sense for how well can we actually perform and what's the equipment allow us to do? What do the people allow us to do? And to me, that's where real process improvement and performance improvement comes from. And ultimately, that's what leads that plant to profitability. And I hope most plants give some type of incentive to their people to participate in that because that's what will drive higher levels of performance, right? If I'm going to get paid the same thing no matter what, I'm not that interested in doing things in the most profitable way, right? So some of it goes back to the culture that's built inside the plant. And I know you've done a lot of work in your career on developing the right cultures.
Yeah, Dave, it's interesting. I had a more in that space had a situation where in CIP, and this was in a dairy plant where we had a lot of piping hookups, and so a lot of CIP, and we were having issues, and it was very sporadic. But someone would forget to get a connection done properly. They wouldn't walk the line before they turned on the CIP, or after and before they turned on production. And when you got 3-inch lines or even a 2-inch line, it doesn't take long, and there's a huge mess and a spill, and it becomes a major issue. And so at one point, the issue was bad enough, and we had our business unit manager lived a bit away, where I was 7 minutes from the plant. So I said, no matter what time of day it happens, I want you to reach out to me. I want to come in and understand the situation more, because I couldn't figure out why we were sporadically having it. We couldn't solve it. It didn't seem that hard. And don't, I get a call at I think it was like 8 o'clock at night. My wife was gone. One of our kids was with her. So I had two kids with me. And I think they were both in pajamas actually, but there was like an 8 and 6-year-old or something. And so I said, all right, I'll be in. So I grabbed the kids. We went in, I put them in my office because I used to bring them in sometimes when they're young. And when I was in there Saturdays to check on the plant and stuff. And so I knew there was some toys in my bottom drawer and stuff. But I go out, and it turns out we had this employee, and the whole plant knew I'd come in. The supervisor had called me, and so I went out with that employee and the supervisor, and we walked the line. And I was really in the seek to understand, like, why did you not do this? And I think it was the time pressure. I think it was we all have that list of things to do. How do you prioritize? I don't think it was ingrained in him yet that this was a priority. Like, this is a step you cannot skip. And he had the spill, and he was scared. Like, I'm pretty sure he thought I was going to walk him out the door after I walked the line, which I did not do. He did take a hit. The supervisor wrote him up. But actually, the conversation we had and finding out kind of what is the root cause here, it ended up helping us walk away from this, and it wasn't an issue, not nearly as big going forward. And I'm sure for various reasons. But that guy, actually, that conversation turned out we had some things in common. I didn't really know him that well. He was relatively new to the plant. But after that, whenever we met, we talked and all of that, and he became an extremely good employee. But it was that seek to understand and understand and help him understand the importance of it. Now, you shouldn't have to go through. We should have had better training. It made it better clarity for him, and he missed obviously on it as well. So not pulling anything from him, but yeah, we ended up in a good spot. But that accountability and showing up at the plant, I think, ended up having a pretty big impact to the facility, because by the time I left, it was like 10 o'clock. My kids were upset with me, but yeah, it made a difference. So.
Yeah,
So I just want
it's a
to,
great story.
it is a great story. It's a very good story. It definitely helps also summarize some of the big takeaways that we have. What I've been hearing is that clarity, transparency, the feedback ratio, conversation is 7 positive remarks to 1 critical remark, continuous improvement, getting employees to participate in metrics, and Darin just gave a good example of employee education, making sure everyone it actually understands what their metrics are and how to achieve them. Did I miss
Yep.
anything? Just as a check-in?
I think that's pretty good. That's a
Okay.
great recap.
Okay, awesome. So we've talked about theoretically approaching accountability, also given some examples that we've had in the past. Now I'd like to throw out a couple scenarios and see if we can cover 1 or 2 of them. You have an employee.
Hey,
Yeah.
Jen, before you go there, I noticed in the chat somebody had a question about how do you rebuild a culture of accountability if it's been lost? Did you see that one?
I did not, but sure, let's discuss it.
Yeah, I just want to respond to it very quickly. And to me, the only way to do that is one accountability conversation at a time, frankly, right? It's being willing to recognize that, hey, we have an accountability problem, and maybe having that conversation as a larger group to say, we want to fix this, right? We want to fix this because we're not meeting certain standards that we need to be able to meet as an organization. And oftentimes, what some people don't recognize is that when a performance at a plant isn't where it needs to be, the consequences of that can be drastic from time to time, right? Whether that means plant closure, the most drastic one, or maybe that it means that we're not meeting the needs of our customers because we're not getting enough product out the door. And then those contracts could go away, which means that we don't have jobs. Again, the most drastic situation. And so when we think about performance and accountability, once you get everyone to agree, we want to be held accountable, right? We want to be held accountable for the positive things as well as the negative things and what we have to do to improve. Then it has to go back to just having accountability conversations and being willing to hold one another accountable. Oftentimes, I think people think that it's the manager or the leader that's required to have accountability conversations. And I think some of the best accountability conversations are had from peer to peer. One of the examples I like to share on this is one of my daughters played college volleyball, and she was a libero, which is she passes the ball oftentimes and serve and when the other team is attacking. And she was a freshman, and her setter was, I think, a junior at the time. And she had been an All-American the year before, so she played to a very high standard. And my daughter was passing the ball to her in one of the early matches of her freshman year. And after the play, the setter came over and grabbed her by her shirt collar and had a face-to-face conversation with her that looked very intense from sitting in the stands as a parent. And after the game, I asked her, I said, what was that all about? And she said, "Oh, Dad, she was just holding me accountable. She wasn't putting the pass exactly where the setter wanted it." And so they had a conversation in the middle of performance, and her performance changed instantly. She started passing better, and they were able to win their match, right? I think oftentimes we're afraid to have a conversation. Now, I'm not telling you to grab your peer by the shirt collar, but we're afraid to have conversations with our peers about things we observe them doing that aren't allowing our performance in the plant to be at maximum productivity, right? We let it go because we're afraid to hurt their feelings or we're not sure how to have that. When we as a group can hold one another accountable, then you get to having real high level performance in a plant. And those are the cultures that I think we're trying to build. It doesn't have to be the plant manager or the line supervisor. It can be us holding one another accountable because ultimately we're all accountable for our own performance. We're adults, right? We know what we're supposed to do. And if we don't, then we need to gain clarity on that. But once we have clarity on our expectations, it's up to us to hold ourselves accountable first. So all accountability conversations have to begin with me saying, did I do my very best work today? And if I can say yes to that, then great. But if my answer is, oh, not really, then I have to start there, right? And then I have to be willing to hold my peers accountable. And then I have to be willing to have that other people hold me accountable. So to me, that's the culture that we're trying to build is a culture of accountability begins with the individual conversation with ourselves first, and then it can extend out to everybody else. But I think it's a great question because oftentimes we lose that accountability. And what happens is our plant performance drops, our team performance drops, right? You might be on a sales team that's selling product to get customers for your plant. Well, you might be not doing everything that you can do to maximize your performance. You got to start with holding yourself accountable to that.
Dave and Jennifer, I just want to weigh on this real quick. We just had a team meeting a few weeks ago, and I got to say one of the walkaways from that was how blessed I am that so many people on our team care about who they work with from a performance standard. So they are there helping each other get stronger. And so it goes beyond just the I want to say happy birthday to them, or I want to do something, but they care about them as people, and they care about them as how they perform in their job. And I think that's awesome. And so that, right, what Dave was saying, who do you want to work with? And I think if you can answer that question, that tells you how you want to treat people around you. And if you want to help them onboard better, to help them grow in what they're doing, and seeing that is amazing.
So, okay, great. So we're talking about culture and accountability. What happens if this isn't something, you aren't in a position where you are like CFS and you love everyone on your team and you want to grow together? Or Dave, you're not seeing that peers are having those accountability conversations. They're just taking the easy way out. How can anyone on this call today start to create that culture? And what advice would you give them to going to those at the top to do more to create that culture and sustain that culture?
Yeah, such a great question, and it can be very challenging. I want to start with that, right? If you are working in a place that doesn't have accountability as part of your culture, you might be holding yourself accountable to doing your best work possible. And then you see other people that are not doing that, right? Well, having a conversation with your boss about, hey, I'm trying to do my best work. Do you recognize that, first of all? And when they do, then you might have to ask the question of how do we get more people on our team to be more accountable so that we as an organization can perform? Because I'll tell you, very few, and I can't think of a single example where I have worked with a group of people that didn't have accountability as part of their culture. If it doesn't exist, you're not a high performing organization. You can't have one without the other. And when you have a high level of accountability, it becomes a great place to work because you're demonstrating all these things that Darin and you and I have been talking about, Jennifer, that because we care about one another, we hold each other accountable. Because we care and we hold each other accountable, we get better performance. And that better performance should lead then to overall profitability for the organization, which is the ultimate measurement in business, right? The fact that we care more about each other. When I see organizations that the people that work there are friends outside of work, I know that they're doing something right inside of work, because most of the time, people that don't hang out after work or aren't willing to come to a party to celebrate one another, right? You hold a group party and there's 80 people at your plant and only 20 show up. That should tell you something, right? When you get 120 that show up, that also tells you something, right? And so it's that you can't have a high performing organization without accountability. So you need to have those conversations, as difficult as they may be. And in organizations where it doesn't exist, you might have to look for a different organization ultimately. Because if you are doing the best work you can do and you don't see it being duplicated elsewhere in the organization and no one's having those conversations, it's a challenging environment to be in.
What is one actionable item, one thing that everyone on the call can do to start to grow in that way?
Darin, you want to jump in first?
Mm. Well, it makes me think of a situation we had. I was a business unit manager. I would say the relationships were not really strong. There was some union friction, and we had a capital project that was coming in. And one thing we did was we consciously set up extremely transparent process. So the engineering manager and there's typically with projects in large companies there can be this, here you go, plant, figure it out, which continues to lead to distrust and incompetent thought process, like who made this decision. And So the engineering manager and I, we purposely set up a internal project team that covered all three shifts. So we would go in on first shift, we'd go in on second shift, and we'd go in on third shift. We rotated them so we actually could sleep. But we had a scheduled plan every 2 weeks. We rotated through the project. All the plans before they were approved were put up so the plant could read them over the course of a week. The people could, the operators could, and get feedback. We had operators on the team. We were very transparent on the costs and the scope. And that project was extremely successful. It wasn't huge. It was a $4.5 million project. But we sent operators down to the equipment manufacturers, which was out of state in a very nice warm state in Florida. Um, and that had never been done before. It was always left for management to do those travels. We just made it regardless of position. If you were affected by that project in a very specific way, you're an operator, sanitation, maintenance, you could be involved in that project very heavily. Project was extremely successful. The people that engaged got awards at the end of it. And it changed, I think it changed the culture of that plant going forward. I mean, we ended up doing another project that was built on the first one, followed the same methodology, and we had, so many people wanted to be involved. We had to manage that. But I think you take those opportunities and do something like that. I think it depends on your scenario, but think through, how do I create something that is great by engaging multiple people, being very transparent about it, and regardless again of position or title, but think about who's really important when you really break it down. Don't let the company structure get in the way. Don't let you know bad practices from the past get in the way. Think of it different. How would you want to do it if you were in each of those positions, and where do you get the best value out of those?
Yeah, I appreciate that response. I'm going to make it a little more simple. If the question is, what is something that anybody on the call can do immediately to try to drive accountability? The very first thing I would recommend you do is gain clarity on role expectations. And so for those of you listening, do you truly know what all the expectations are of you in your role? If you can write those down on a piece of paper, and verify those with your boss, then you know you have the right clarity. Because if you're missing something, they'll tell you. And if you got something on there that you're not responsible for, you probably just became responsible for it. They probably won't take it away. But understanding that then allows you to hold yourself accountable. And to me, that's where all of this starts, is how do I understand the expectations for my role and I hold myself accountable? Because if you're doing that and you're being honest in your self-assessment, right? I have my list of 9 things or 19 things, whatever it might be. How am I doing in each one of these different areas? And you can do that honest self-assessment, then your performance is undoubtedly going to improve, because then you'll start to say, well, this area I'm not doing as well as I think I should. What do I need to do differently? What needs to change? And if you can help identify that behavior, right, then you can go get the right help, right? People are available to help you in every organization, especially when you go ask for it. So I think that's the first thing I would recommend, is do that role clarity and then an honest self-assessment of how are you doing to those expectations.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, we have approached the end of our hour, but I think that we have some good takeaways. We've had some great engagement. I love that we summarized it at the end, that really the main thing that you need to start with is caring about one another, caring about yourself enough to know about what you need to do to make the job most successful, be most successful at your job, and caring about your team, caring about them as individuals, as people, and checking in with them. I love all of that. Thank you both. Thank you to everyone again who joined, who participated. We definitely had a nice, rich conversation. Before we wrap up and end for today, I want to make sure that everyone is aware that we do have a professional development book club featuring my life in Full, Work, Family, and Our Future. That book club conversation is led by Wan, and it is today at 3 p.m. Next Wednesday, I hope to see many of you also on our webinar. We'll continue the leadership conversation with building the next generation of leaders in food manufacturing. And as we head into September, which is Food Safety Month, we also have quite a bit of programming to look forward to as well. Please look at, find all the details for registration on our FPSA website. Dave and Darin, thank you again for spending this hour with us, for all of your knowledge, for all of your experience and expertise. We greatly appreciate your participation. Hopefully everyone took something practical from this conversation as well. So
Thank you. Ciao.
thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jen. See you, Dave.